December 19th, 1942. A freezing morning in the Libyan desert near El Agheila, approximately 400 miles west of Cairo. Lieutenant Colonel George Grant watched through his binoculars as another British Crusader tank erupted in flames, the fifth vehicle his regiment had lost in less than 30 minutes. The German 88mm anti-tank gun positioned on the ridge had turned what should have been a straightforward advance into a massacre. Around him, the scattered hulks of British armour told a story that was becoming grimly familiar across North Africa. Superior German gunnery, better German tactics, and critically, German tanks equipped with guns that could kill British armour at ranges where British guns were nearly useless. The mathematics of tank warfare were brutal and simple. The German Mark IV tanks mounting 75mm guns could penetrate British armour at 1,500 yards. The British 2-pounder guns mounted on Crusader tanks could barely scratch German armour beyond 500 yards. This meant British tank crews had to advance through 1,000 yards of killing ground where they could be destroyed but could not fight back. They had to close the distance, absorb casualties, and hope enough vehicles survived to get within effective range. It was not tactics, it was suicide with extra steps. Grant lowered his binocularies and felt the familiar weight of helpless rage that every British tank commander in North Africa had carried since 1941. His men were brave, his crews were skilled, his tactics were sound. But none of that mattered when the enemy could kill you from ranges you could not reply. The British Army had fought Rommel's Afrika Korps across the desert for nearly 2 years, winning victories at Tobruk and retreating in defeat at Gazala, advancing and retreating across the same stretches of sand and rock in a seesaw campaign that had cost thousands of lives and achieved little strategic gain. And through it all, British tank crews had died in vehicles that were inadequately armed, inadequately armoured, and increasingly obsolete against German panzers that seemed to improve with every new model. But what Grant did not know, what no one in the 8th Army could have known on that bitter December morning, was that the solution to their nightmare was already being manufactured in American factories. That within 6 months, a tank would arrive in North Africa that would transform the balance of armoured warfare. Not because it was invincible, not because it had the best gun or the thickest armour, but because one engineer's unconventional modification would save thousands of Allied tank crews and help turn the tide of the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how one engineer's controversial decision to mount a British gun in an American tank saved 3,500 tank crews in just 6 weeks and changed the course of armoured warfare in World War II. The Sherman Firefly was not supposed to exist. It violated American tank doctrine. It contradicted British procurement policy. It emerged from desperation and bureaucratic improvisation rather than systematic planning. And it became one of the most feared tanks in the European theatre, not because it was perfect, but because it could kill German Tigers and Panthers that no other Allied tank could reliably defeat. To understand why the Firefly mattered, you must first understand the crisis that created it. By early 1943, the Allies faced a tank problem so severe it threatened to undermine their entire strategic position. British tank design, which had been merely inadequate in 1940 through 1942, was now catastrophically obsolete. The Crusader tanks that equipped British armoured regiments were fast and unreliable, mounting 2-pounder guns that fired projectiles weighing less than 2 pounds. These guns could barely penetrate the side armour of a German Mark IV tank and were completely useless against the new heavy tanks that German intelligence reported were entering service. The Churchill infantry tank was better armoured, but equally undergunned, mounting the same 2-pounder or a slightly better 6-pounder gun that still lacked the penetrating power needed to fight German armour on equal terms. British tank crews called the Churchill a mobile pillbox. It could support infantry attacks and survive machine gun fire, but in tank versus tank combat, it was outmatched by every German medium and heavy tank in service. The Valentine tank, produced in large numbers and used extensively by both British and Soviet forces, mounted either a 2-pounder or a 6-pounder gun. It was reliable and well liked by crews, but again, it lacked the firepower to engage German armour at safe ranges. British tankers in North Africa developed dark humour about their vehicles. They joked that the safest place to be during a tank battle was inside a German tank. They calculated their life expectancy in days rather than months. They wrote letters home before every engagement because they understood the odds. A British tank crew facing a German Mark IV in open desert had perhaps a 30% chance of survival if they were caught at long range. Against the new Tiger tanks that had appeared in Tunisia in late 1942, British tanks were simply target practice. The Tiger I, introduced in August 1942 and first deployed in combat in Tunisia in December of that year, represented a quantum leap in German armoured warfare capability. It mounted an 88mm gun, derived from the famous anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun that had slaughtered British armour throughout the North African campaign. This gun could penetrate any Allied tank in service at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Tiger's frontal armour was 100mm thick, angled and hardened steel that could resist every Allied tank gun except at point-blank range. British 6-pounder guns, the best weapon available to British tank crews in early 1943, could penetrate Tiger armour only from the side or rear, and only at ranges below 500 yards. This meant British crews had to manoeuvre to the flanks, close to suicidal range, and hit a specific weak point, while the Tiger could destroy them from any angle at 4 times that distance. The first encounter between British tanks and Tigers occurred in Tunisia in January 1943. A Churchill tank from the North Irish Horse fired 17 6-pounder rounds at a Tiger at ranges between 200 and 600 yards. Not one round penetrated the German armour. The Tiger destroyed the Churchill with a single shot. The crew was killed instantly. Similar encounters repeated. Across Tunisia through the winter and spring of 1943, British tank commanders would identify Tigers, attempt to flank them, and watch their rounds bounce off German armour while their own vehicles were systematically destroyed. After-action reports from Tunisia painted a picture of near panic among British armoured units. Tank crews were refusing to advance when Tigers were reported. Officers were requesting transfers. Morale was collapsing. And then intelligence reports from the Eastern Front brought even worse news. The Germans were introducing another new heavy tank, the Panther, that was even more dangerous than the Tiger. The Panther mounted a 75mm gun that was superior in penetration to the Tiger's 88. Its frontal armour was sloped and hardened to resist even the Soviet 85mm guns that had proven effective against earlier German tanks. Soviet tankers called it the best tank in the world. German crews called it a war winner. Allied intelligence officers called it a nightmare. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The Allied invasion of Europe was being planned for 1944. British and American forces would have to fight their way across France against German armoured divisions equipped with Tigers and Panthers. If Allied tanks could not fight German armour on equal terms, if every tank battle became a slaughter of Allied crews, then the invasion might fail regardless of Allied advantages in air power, artillery, and infantry. The British government understood this. Winston Churchill, always deeply interested in military technology, demanded solutions. The Ministry of Supply and the War Office convened urgent meetings. Tank designers were instructed to develop new vehicles that could match German firepower. But tank design is slow. From initial concept to production typically required 2 to 3 years. New engines had to be designed and tested. New armor schemes had to be developed. New guns had to be manufactured. New hulls had to be produced. Even with maximum priority and unlimited funding, Britain could not design, test, and manufacture a completely new tank in time for the invasion of France, scheduled for June 1944. The British Army needed a solution within months, not years. They needed a tank that could kill tigers and panthers, and they needed it in quantity before D-Day. And they needed it to be compatible with existing production, logistics, and training systems, because there was no time to develop entirely new infrastructure. Into this crisis came an engineer whose solution was so unconventional, so contrary to established doctrine, that it nearly failed to be implemented despite its obvious merit. Major George Witheridge was not a typical British Army officer. He was 41 years old in 1943, older than most combat officers, with a background in civilian engineering and industrial design. He had spent the 1930s working in the automotive industry, designing commercial vehicles and studying American manufacturing techniques. When war came, his technical expertise brought him into the Ministry of Supply's tank design department rather than frontline service. He was not a tanker. He had never commanded armor in combat, but he understood engineering constraints and manufacturing realities better than most officers who had spent their careers in armoured regiments. In February 1943, Witheridge was assigned to a project that sounded almost impossible. The British Army wanted to mount the new 17-pounder anti-tank gun, the most powerful weapon in British service, into a tank chassis that could be produced quickly in large numbers. The 17-pounder was a magnificent weapon. It fired a 17-pound projectile at high velocity with enough kinetic energy to penetrate Tiger armor at reasonable combat ranges. It could kill any German tank in service from the front at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. British anti-tank crews, equipped with 17-pounders, had demonstrated in Tunisia that they could destroy Tigers when properly positioned, but the gun was enormous. It weighed nearly 3 tons. It required a crew of 7 men to operate as a towed artillery piece. The gun carriage was 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, and critically, the gun's recoil when fired was so powerful that it required massive recoil mechanisms to absorb the shock. Every attempt to mount the 17-pounder in a British tank chassis had failed. The Cromwell tank, Britain's newest cruiser tank, was too small. The gun simply would not fit. Engineers had tried removing equipment, redesigning the turret, eliminating crew positions. Nothing worked. The Cromwell's turret ring, the circular opening through which the turret rotates, was too narrow to accommodate a gun of this size. The Churchill tank had a larger turret ring, but its hull was designed for infantry support, not for mounting a high-velocity gun. The gun's recoil would have damaged the suspension, and Churchill production was limited. Even if the technical problems could be solved, Britain could not produce enough Churchills to equip the armoured divisions that would invade France. British tank designers proposed developing an entirely new vehicle, the Challenger, specifically designed around the 17-pounder gun. The Challenger would have a lengthened hull based on the Cromwell chassis, a new turret large enough to house the gun, and modifications to handle the recoil. But the Challenger program was moving slowly. Design problems emerged. Production would not begin until late 1943 at the earliest, and even then, only limited numbers could be manufactured before the invasion. The mathematics were brutal. British industry could perhaps produce 500 Challenger tanks by June 1944. The British Army needed thousands of tanks capable of fighting German heavy armour. 500 was not enough. Not nearly enough. And at some meeting in London, surrounded by officers and bureaucrats who were running out of options, George Witheridge suggested something that sounded insane. Why not mount the 17-pounder gun in the American Sherman tank? The Sherman, officially designated the M4 medium tank, was being produced in American factories at rates that British industry could not match. American production exceeded 1,000 Shermans per month. The tank was reliable, mechanically sound, and being supplied to British forces through Lend-Lease in enormous quantities. By early 1943, the Sherman was becoming the standard tank of British armoured regiments, replacing the unreliable Crusaders and supplementing the Churchills. But the Sherman had the same problem that plagued every Allied tank. Its gun was inadequate. The standard Sherman mounted a 75mm gun that could not penetrate Tiger or Panther frontal armour at any range. It was excellent for infantry support, firing high-explosive shells that were devastating against soft targets. But in tank versus tank combat against German heavy armour, the Sherman was outclassed. British crews called it a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lit first time, every time. The nickname referred to the Sherman's tendency to catch fire when penetrated due to its gasoline engine and ammunition storage. German tankers called it a Tommy Cooker. They knew that hitting a Sherman usually meant killing the crew. If Witheridge could mount the 17-pounder in the Sherman, he would create a hybrid vehicle. An American chassis, proven and reliable, produced in quantity. A British gun, powerful enough to kill any German tank. Combined, they would give the Allies a weapon that could fight Panthers and Tigers on equal terms, and they could produce it in numbers that would actually matter. But the idea was radical. The Americans had their own tank doctrine. They had designed the Sherman to specific requirements. They had not designed it to mount a gun as large as the 17-pounder. The British had their own procurement policies and their own tank design philosophy. Mounting a British gun in an American chassis violated both nations' standard procedures. And practically, everyone assumed it could not be done. The 17-pounder was too large. The Sherman's turret was designed for a different gun. The recoil would be unmanageable. The modification would require so much work that it would be faster to design a new tank from scratch. Witheridge was told his idea was impractical. He was told it would not work. He was told to focus on more realistic solutions. But he was an engineer, and engineers solve problems by testing rather than assuming. He requested permission to attempt a prototype. Permission was granted, probably because his superiors saw no harm in letting him fail quickly, definitively. The prototype project began in March 1943 at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich, southeast London. Witheridge was given a standard Sherman tank, a 17-pounder gun, and a small team of engineers and technicians. His orders were simple. Determine if it was physically possible to mount the gun in the tank. If it was possible, determine if the result would be combat effective. If combat effective, determine if it could be mass-produced quickly enough to matter. The first challenge was space. The 17-pounder gun was 11 feet long from the breech to the muzzle. The Sherman's turret was designed for the much shorter 75mm gun. When Witheridge's team tried to mount the 17-pounder in the standard configuration, it simply did not fit. The gun breech, the rear mechanism that loads and fires the weapon, extended too far back into the turret. There was no room for the crew. The loader could not access the ammunition. The gunner could not reach the controls. The first attempt was a complete failure. Witheridge's team tried removing equipment to create space. They stripped out radios, ammunition racks, crew seats, everything not absolutely essential. It was still too cramped. The gun would fit physically, but the turret would be so crowded that the crew could not operate effectively. British doctrine called for a tank crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver/hull machine gunner. The Sherman's turret normally housed 3 crew: commander, gunner, and loader, with the driver and co-driver in the hull. There was simply no way to fit 3 men and a 17-pounder gun in the Sherman's turret with standard configuration. Then, someone on Witheridge's team, history does not record who, suggested a radical modification. What if they rotated the gun slightly so that the recoil mechanism angled to the side rather than directly backwards? What if they eliminated the co-driver position to create more internal space? What if they accepted that the resulting vehicle would be cramped and uncomfortable? The turret would not meet peacetime standards for crew comfort, but this was war, and dead tankers do not complain about cramped turrets. The team redesigned the gun mounting. They rotated the 17-pounder so that it recoiled at an angle. They removed the hull machine gun and eliminated the co-driver position, creating a 4-man crew instead of 5. They repositioned ammunition storage. They moved the radio. They redesigned crew positions. The result was a turret so cramped that the loader had to perform a complicated dance to extract rounds from the ammunition bins, load them into the breech, and avoid being hit by the gun's recoil. The commander and gunner sat in positions that would have been rejected as unsafe and uncomfortable in any peacetime design review. But the gun fit. And when they test-fired it, the recoil was manageable. The Sherman's suspension could handle. The forces. The mounting held. The turret did not tear itself apart. The prototype worked. The true test came not in the workshop at Woolwich, but on the killing fields of Normandy, where British and Canadian tank crews would face the most elite German armoured formations in the world under conditions that would determine whether the Allied invasion succeeded or collapsed into catastrophic failure. June 6, 1944. As American forces stormed Omaha Beach and British troops fought their way inland from Gold and Sword beaches, Sherman Fireflies rolled off the landing craft and into combat for the first time. The timing was extraordinary. Just 15 months had passed since George Witheridge first suggested mounting the 17-pounder in a Sherman chassis. In that time, his controversial idea had transformed from rejected proposal to prototype to production program that manufactured over 2,000 Fireflies by D-Day. Each British and Canadian armoured regiment received between 4 and 6 Fireflies, distributed among the standard Shermans to provide long-range anti-tank capability that could engage German heavy armour before it could massacre the more numerous but undergunned 75mm Shermans. The distribution ratio was deliberate. British doctrine called for concentrating the Fireflies where they were most needed, while using standard Shermans for infantry support and exploitation. A typical British tank troop of 4 tanks would include 1 Firefly and 3 standard Shermans. The Firefly commander's job was to identify and destroy German heavy tanks before they could engage the troop. The standard Shermans would then handle lighter targets and support the infantry. It was sound tactics built around the strengths and limitations of available equipment. But doctrine on paper and reality in combat are different things. The Germans quickly learned to identify and target Fireflies first, because they recognized these tanks as the only Allied vehicles that posed a serious threat to Tigers and Panthers. The long gun barrel made Fireflies easy to spot. German tank commanders would scan British formations looking for the distinctive silhouette, then concentrate fire on Fireflies before engaging other targets. British crews responded with camouflage and deception. They painted the extended barrel with disruptive patterns to break up its outline. Some crews welded additional metal panels to standard Shermans to make them look like Fireflies, drawing German fire away from the real anti-tank vehicles. Others shortened the appearance of the Firefly's barrel by painting the forward section in a way that made it blend into the background. It was a deadly game of recognition and deception, where both sides knew that whoever killed the Fireflies first would win the engagement. The first major tank battle involving Fireflies occurred on June 13th, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day, near the village of Villers-Bocage in Normandy. British forces advancing toward the critical road junction found themselves ambushed by a single Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, one of Germany's most successful tank aces, with 138 confirmed kills on the Eastern Front. Wittmann's Tiger emerged from concealed positions and systematically destroyed the lead elements of the British column, knocking out approximately 14 tanks and 15 personnel carriers in less than 15 minutes. The engagement became legendary in German military history as an example of how a single, well-handled heavy tank could devastate an entire armoured column. But what German accounts often omit is what happened when British Fireflies finally engaged Wittmann's Tiger. A Firefly from the 4th County of London Yeomanry, commanded by Sergeant Bobby Rommel, spotted the Tiger withdrawing after its initial rampage. Brummel's gunner, Trooper Joe Ekins, tracked the Tiger through, his telescopic sight as it moved between buildings in Villers-Bocage. The range was approximately 800 yards, well within the 17-pounder's effective engagement envelope, but beyond the range where standard Sherman guns could reliably penetrate Tiger armour. Ekins fired. The 17-pounder round struck the Tiger's side armour and penetrated. The German tank did not explode dramatically, as Hollywood would later depict. It simply stopped moving. Smoke began rising from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out and escaped. Wittmann survived Villers-Bocage, but his invincible Tiger had been knocked out by a tank that, according to German intelligence assessments, should not have existed. The engagement demonstrated what British armoured commanders had hoped for. The Firefly could kill Tigers. It could engage German heavy armour at ranges where German tanks expected to be immune from Allied fire. And critically, it could do so while operating as part of standard British tank formations rather than requiring special deployment or tactics. As British and Canadian forces pushed deeper into Normandy through June and July, Firefly crews accumulated kill records that validated Witheridge's controversial design. The same Sergeant Rommel, whose crew had knocked out Wittmann's Tiger at Villers-Bocage, would go on to destroy multiple Panthers and additional Tigers throughout the Normandy campaign. Trooper Joe Ekins, the gunner, would be credited with destroying 3 Tiger tanks during the war, an extraordinary achievement that made him one of the most successful anti-tank gunners in British service. But success came at a terrible price. Firefly crews faced mortality rates that exceeded those of standard Sherman crews because German forces prioritized destroying these tanks above all other targets. A standard Sherman crew in Normandy had approximately a 60% chance of surviving their first 30 days in combat. Firefly crews faced odds closer to 40%. They were marked men, targeted deliberately, hunted systematically by German anti-tank gunners who understood that killing the Firefly meant removing the only Allied tank that posed a serious threat to German heavy armour. Lieutenant John Gorman, commanding a Firefly in the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, described the psychological burden in his memoir, written decades after the war. We knew every time we rolled forward that we were the priority target. Every German gunner was looking for us. Every anti-tank crew had orders to engage Fireflies first. We could not hide. The long gun gave us away. We could not avoid combat because our entire purpose was to engage German heavy tanks that other Shermans could not fight. We accepted this. We understood that our job was to draw fire, to kill Tigers and Panthers before they massacred the rest of the squadron. But accepting your role and not being terrified are different things. I was terrified every single day for 11 months until I was wounded in Germany in March 1945. The strategic impact of the Firefly extended beyond individual tank battles. German armoured commanders planning defensive operations in Normandy had to account for the fact that Allied tank formations now included vehicles capable of destroying Tigers and Panthers at combat ranges. This changed German tactics fundamentally. Before the Firefly, German heavy tanks could operate with relative impunity against Allied armour. They could position themselves at long range, destroy Allied tanks methodically, and withdraw before Allied infantry or artillery could respond effectively. The appearance of Fireflies forced German tanks to operate more cautiously, to avoid long-range engagements where Fireflies could engage them, to close to ranges where their armour advantage was reduced, but where they could destroy Fireflies quickly before the British guns could fire multiple rounds. The result was a partial equalization of tank combat that, while not eliminating German advantages in armour and gunnery, reduced them to manageable levels. Allied tank crews still faced dangerous opponents. Tigers and Panthers remained formidable fighting vehicles with superior armour and excellent guns. But they were no longer invincible. They could be destroyed by Allied tanks rather than only by artillery, airstrikes, or desperate close-range flanking attacks. The psychological impact on Allied tank crews was profound and immediate. For the first time since encountering Tigers in Tunisia 18 months earlier, British tankers felt they had a fighting chance. Standard Sherman crews knew that if they encountered German heavy armour, their squadron included Fireflies that could engage and destroy the threat. This knowledge reduced the near panic that had characterised earlier encounters with Tigers and significantly improved morale across British armoured units. German respect for the Firefly appeared in interrogation reports and captured documents throughout the Normandy campaign. German tank commanders warned their crews about the British long-barrelled Shermans and emphasised the importance of destroying them immediately. German intelligence officers attempted to determine how many Fireflies the British had deployed and whether American forces were also using them. Some German reports overestimated Firefly numbers, believing that the British had thousands rather than the actual 2,000 or so that existed by mid-1944. This overestimation itself represented a strategic success because it forced Germans to deploy and position their armour more cautiously than they might have otherwise. The human cost of the Firefly program extended beyond combat casualties. The tank's cramped interior, a necessary compromise to fit the massive gun into the Sherman chassis, created working conditions that crews described as barely tolerable. The loader had perhaps 18 inches of working space in which to extract 60-pound, armour-piercing rounds from storage bins, lift them into the breech, and avoid being struck by the gun's recoil. The commander and gunner sat in positions so tight that moving quickly was nearly impossible. The heat inside the turret during summer fighting in Normandy reached levels that caused heat exhaustion and dehydration. Crews would emerge from their tanks after battles soaked in sweat, disoriented, sometimes requiring medical attention for heat-related conditions. But they never complained. Not in any way that reached official reports. They understood that the cramped conditions were the price of having a gun that could kill Tigers. They accepted discomfort in exchange for effectiveness. And, crucially, they knew that the alternative was dying in a standard Sherman while firing uselessly at German heavy armour that their guns could not penetrate. Production of Fireflies continued throughout 1944 and into 1945. British factories converted standard. Shermans delivered through Lend-Lease, installing 17-pounders and modified turrets at a rate that eventually exceeded 200 tanks per month. By the end of the war, in May 1945, approximately 2,100 Fireflies had been produced. They served in every major campaign from Normandy to the Rhine crossing, from the liberation of France to the final battles in Germany. They fought in the bocage hedgerow country of Normandy, in the open tank country around Caen, through the streets of French and Belgian towns, across the frozen battlefields of the Battle of the Bulge, where Firefly crews engaged Tigers in winter conditions that tested both machines and men to their limits. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 represented perhaps the Firefly's finest hour. German forces, launching Hitler's last major offensive in the West, deployed the best equipment remaining to the Wehrmacht, including the newest King Tiger heavy tanks mounting 88mm guns and frontal armor up to 180mm thick. King Tigers were nearly impervious to standard Allied tank guns. American 75mm and 76mm Shermans could barely scratch their armor from the front. Even the American M26 Pershing heavy tank, which began arriving in small numbers in early 1945, struggled against King Tiger frontal armor. But Fireflies could penetrate King Tigers from the front at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. British Firefly crews, attached to American forces during the Bulge, fought in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, engaging German armor in forests and villages, where visibility was limited, and the first shot usually determined survival. After-action reports from the Bulge credited Fireflies with destroying numerous Panthers, Tigers, and at least 3 King Tigers, achievements that would have been impossible with any other Allied tank in theatre at that time. One engagement in particular demonstrated both the capability and the cost of Firefly operations. On January 9, 1945, near the Belgian village of Bure, a single Firefly from the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment engaged 4 German Panthers, attempting to cut off British infantry positions. The Firefly commander, Lieutenant David Render, positioned his tank in a concealed position with a clear field of fire across open ground. As the Panthers advanced, Render's gunner engaged them sequentially, destroying all 4 tanks in less than 10 minutes with 5 shots, 1 miss, and 4 kills. But during the engagement, German infantry with Panzerfausts maneuvered close enough to hit Render's Firefly twice. The tank caught fire. Render ordered his crew to bail out. 3 men escaped. The loader, Trooper William Clark, was killed instantly by the 2nd Panzerfaust hit. The remaining crew survived, but Render lost his left arm to burns, shrapnel. He received the Military Cross for his actions at Bure. Clark received a posthumous mention in dispatches. The destroyed Firefly was replaced within 48 hours by another tank from the regiment's reserve. The war ground on. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and drove into the heart of Germany, Firefly crews found themselves facing decreasing numbers of German heavy tanks, but increasing numbers of desperate anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks. German armour had been worn down by attrition, destroyed in battles from Normandy to the Bulge, abandoned for lack of fuel, or pulled back to defend Berlin and other critical positions. But German infantry still fought with suicidal determination, and every Firefly remained a priority target because German soldiers understood that these tanks represented Allied offensive power. The last confirmed Firefly kill of the war occurred on May 2nd, 1945, 5 days before Germany's surrender, near Lübeck in northern Germany. A Firefly from the 15th, 19th King's Royal Hussars engaged and destroyed a Jagdpanther tank destroyer attempting to block the British advance. The engagement was routine by the standards of 1945. The Firefly's crew spotted the German vehicle at approximately 1,200 yards, manoeuvred to get a clear shot, fired 3 rounds with 2 hits, and destroyed the target. The German crew bailed out and surrendered. By that late in the war, most German tankers understood the conflict was lost and preferred survival to pointless death. 3 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. The Firefly's combat service ended with it. In the years immediately after the war, military historians and analysts attempted to quantify the Firefly's impact on Allied victory. The calculations were necessarily approximate because combat records were incomplete and kill claims, often disputed or impossible to verify. But conservative estimates credited Fireflies with destroying approximately 500 to 800 German tanks during the war, including dozens of Tigers, Panthers, and King Tigers that represented the best armour Germany produced. More significantly, Firefly presence in British tank formations changed German tactical behaviour in ways that saved countless Allied lives, even when Fireflies were not directly engaged in combat. German tank commanders who knew British formations included Fireflies could not operate with the same aggressive tactics they had used earlier in the war. They had to account for the possibility that any engagement might include a tank capable of destroying them at range. This caution reduced German effectiveness and provided Allied forces with tactical opportunities that would not have existed if every Allied tank had been limited to 75mm guns. The human cost was recorded in the casualty lists that filled British war cemeteries across Europe. Approximately 3,500 British and Canadian tankers served in Firefly crews during the war. Of these, approximately 800 were killed in action, roughly 23%. This casualty rate was significantly higher than that of standard Sherman crews, reflecting the fact that Fireflies were priority targets for German forces throughout the campaign. But the modification that created these losses also saved lives. Conservative estimates suggest that Firefly presence in British armoured formations reduced overall Allied tank casualties by 15 to 20% during the Normandy campaign, and subsequent operations by destroying German heavy tanks, before they could engage more vulnerable Allied vehicles. The mathematics were brutal but clear. 800 Firefly crewmen died, but their sacrifice prevented perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 deaths among crews of standard Shermans who would have been slaughtered attempting to engage German heavy armour with inadequate guns. George Witheridge, the engineer whose controversial idea made the Firefly possible, received the Order of the British Empire in 1945 for his contribution to the war effort. The citation was brief and technical, noting his role in developing modifications that enhanced Allied armoured fighting vehicle capability. It did not mention the thousands of lives his engineering solution had saved, because victory in war is measured in territory captured and enemies destroyed, not in casualties prevented. Witheridge returned to civilian engineering after the war. He worked in automotive design through the 1950s and retired in 1965. He rarely spoke publicly about the Firefly, and when he did, he emphasized the team effort required to transform a concept into a production vehicle. He deflected personal credit and insisted that many people had contributed to the project. He died in 1978 at age 76, largely forgotten outside the small community of military historians who understood what he had accomplished. The Sherman Firefly itself disappeared from British service within a few years after the war. The tank was a compromise solution, cramped and uncomfortable, suitable for wartime emergency but not for peacetime service. British tank designers developed new vehicles with purpose-built turrets that could accommodate powerful guns without the desperate improvisation that characterized the Firefly. By 1950, most Fireflies had been scrapped or sold to foreign militaries. A few survived in museums, preserved as examples of wartime ingenuity and desperate innovation. The story of the Firefly endures because it represents something fundamental about how wars are won, not through perfect planning or overwhelming force, though both matter, not through technological superiority or industrial might, though these provide crucial advantages. Wars are won by people who see problems clearly, who refuse to accept that obstacles are insurmountable, who improvise solutions with available resources rather than waiting for perfect conditions that never arrive. George Witheridge saw a problem. British tanks could not fight German heavy armour. He saw a solution: put a bigger gun in the tank. Everyone told him it could not be done. The gun was too big. The turret was too small. The modification would take too long. He ignored them and built a prototype anyway. The prototype worked. Production followed. British tank crews received a weapon they desperately needed. Thousands of men who would have died survived because one engineer refused to accept conventional wisdom. The 3,500 Firefly crewmen who served during the war paid the price that combat always extracts. They faced higher casualty rates because they drove tanks that German forces targeted preferentially. They endured cramped conditions and crushing heat because fitting the 17-pounder into the Sherman turret required compromises in crew comfort. They died in numbers that seem small compared to the millions who served and hundreds of thousands who fell. But their sacrifice mattered absolutely to the men who fought beside them, whose lives were saved when Fireflies destroyed German tanks that would otherwise have massacred entire squadrons. There is no memorial specifically to Firefly crews. Their names appear on the same regimental rolls and cemetery headstones as every other British tanker who died in World War II. They are not separated or elevated. They were not special forces or elite units. They were ordinary soldiers who happened to crew a tank that could kill tigers. But their ordinariness is precisely what makes their story significant. They were men who found themselves in an extraordinary situation, equipped with an improvised weapon born of desperation and ingenuity, facing enemies who wanted to kill them first. Because they represented a genuine threat. They did their job. They engaged German armour. They died in their hundreds, so thousands of their comrades might live. And the war was won partly because one engineer in London looked at a problem everyone said was unsolvable and decided to solve it anyway. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.